A lot of firms believe they have a household relationship when what they really have is one strong relationship inside a household.
Yes, and that difference matters a lot more than people think. A relationship can look shared on paper, even when in real life, most of the trust is still sitting with one person.
On the surface, it can look like the whole household is included. Both people may show up to some meetings. The household has been with the firm for years.
And still, most of the real trust may be sitting with one person. That's what makes this such an important trust issue.
This is Advising Humans, where we talk about the human side of advice and what's often happening underneath the visible conversation.
And in this episode, we're looking at one of the quieter weaknesses advisor change can expose. The relationship may look shared on paper, but in reality, most of the trust may be sitting with one person.
And that can stay hidden for a long time.
Right, until the less engaged person suddenly has to decide whether they actually want to keep going.
I think that's such an important distinction because from the outside, a household can look fully covered.
Right. Both people attend some meetings. The household has been with the firm for years. So from the advisor's side, it can look stable. But stability can be misleading if one person has been carrying most of the real connection all along.
And that's where this starts to get uncomfortable. A lot of firms say they serve the household, but the relationship may still revolve around one primary contact.
Exactly. That's the pattern you start to see pretty clearly here. The advisor may know one person's goals, worries, personality, and decision-making style in a very real way, while the spouse or partner is more present than included.
Present, but not fully engaged.
Right. They may be in the room, but not fully known, not fully asked, not fully brought into the relationship in a way that builds independent trust.
And that probably doesn't feel like a problem while the primary relationship is still intact.
Exactly. That's what makes it easy to miss. The household can look stable as long as the familiar structure stays in place. But once something changes, a death, a transition, an advisor departure, the weakness becomes much more visible.
Because now the person who was less engaged may suddenly be the person deciding whether to stay.
Yes. And that becomes a completely different kind of test. The question is no longer whether the household has accounts with the firm. The question becomes whether this person actually feels known, understood, and safe enough to keep going.
I think one of the clearest places this shows up is with widowed client retention, and that's one of the most revealing examples.
It really is. A Cerulli Associates research on widows and widowers found that 85% stayed with the incumbent advisor overall, but men stayed at 91%, while women stayed at 81%. That's a meaningful gap. It shows that continuity can look very different depending on who in the household actually had the deeper relationship. If the surviving spouse was never fully brought into that trust, then the relationship may be much more fragile than the firm realized.
And that makes total sense on a human level. If someone is grieving and also realizes, I don't actually have much of a relationship with the person now guiding me, of course that feels shaky.
Exactly. The moment becomes about much more than money. It becomes about whether the person across the table feels familiar enough, thoughtful enough, and trustworthy enough in a moment that already feels destabilizing.
And if the answer is no, even quietly, the household becomes much more vulnerable.
Right. Which is why that primary contact pattern becomes such a big issue. If the firm built most of the relationship with one person, then the so-called household continuity may have been overstated all along.
And this doesn't stop with spouses.
No. The next generation piece is just as important. A lot of firms say they serve families across generations, but in practice, they may have very little real relationship with the adult children who will eventually inherit assets.
So the assets may transfer, but the trust doesn't.
Exactly, and Cerulli's research makes that problem pretty clear. Only 27% of people expecting an inheritance say they would keep the managing advisor, and that drops to 20% among those who already inherited. Cerulli also found that only 19% of affluent investors use their parents' advisor. Firms often assume that if they've served the parents well, the next generation will naturally stay. But that only works if the relationship was actually extended to them in a meaningful way.
Which often it wasn't.
Right, the heirs may know the advisor exists. They may have met them once or twice, but that's very different from having a real relationship. Very different from feeling known. Very different from believing this is someone I want to trust with my future.
So from the firm's side, it may feel like a family relationship.
But to the next generation, it may feel like this was their parents' advisor, not theirs.
That's such an important difference.
It is. An advisor change exposes that same issue even before a wealth transfer. The minute the central advisor relationship changes, all the weaker connections around it become much more obvious.
Because if trust was never shared across the household, continuity starts depending on people who may never have felt fully included.
Exactly, and that means the issue is not just communication, it's how the relationship was built in the first place. Household continuity depends on whether trust has been built in more than one place.
Not just whether two names are on the account.
Right, shared paperwork is not the same as shared trust.
That line really says it.
Because firms can mistake being nearby for being truly connected. The spouse was there, the children were aware, the household was technically covered. But none of that guarantees those people actually feel anchored in the relationship.
And if they don't, the relationship is weaker than it looks.
Exactly, which is why this episode matters so much. If only one person in the household truly feels known, then continuity is more fragile than the firm thinks.
An advisor change is often the moment that reveals that.
Yes, it shows whether the relationship was really shared or whether one person had been carrying most of the trust all along.
So if we were putting this into one line, it might be this. A household relationship is not real just because multiple people are nearby. It's real when multiple people actually feel known.
I think that's exactly right. And the firms that handle this well understand that continuity has to be built across the household before the moment of change arrives. Because if trust lives mostly with one person, the relationship is more fragile than it looks.
If this conversation made you think differently about what household continuity really means, share it with another advisor or leader who cares about building trust that extends beyond one person.
And if you want a more consistent way for your team to handle advisor change, the Advisor Change Transition Playbook Suite for Advisors gives you shared language, meeting flow, and practical tools to strengthen relationships with spouses, partners, and future generations.
Because household continuity is only real when more than one person actually feels known.
Thanks for listening to Advising Humans.
We'll see you next time.